G'day legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic day and so far you are having a fantastic week. Now if you notice the video looks a little bit different, I'm filming this far later in the day than I usually do. I've just come back from the chemo infusion clinic after getting some fluids, and as soon as I press stop on this video I'll take my last round of chemotherapy, at least for this cycle, and so far I'm feeling okay. But highly likely I'll be having the next couple of days off work. So thank you for all of your support. If you'd like to support me, of course, there's the links down below, but never, ever feel obliged. Now, legends, of course, as always, we do have a lot to go over. Of course, I'm going to be showing you the maps. I'm going to talk about some difficulties on the map movements and resupply due to drones. Speaking of drones, we're going to go and talk at length about Garand drones, the manufacturing of these, which we were correct on, that many people said we weren't correct, but we are. Some different types of drones entering, some of the problems here, intercepting these, all the bits and pieces, talk about glide bombs and aircraft, and then the main meat of this video is going to be, of course, about the NATO summit. Yes, it was a very quick summit. We're going to talk about America, Ukraine, NATO, Ukraine, and then talk about a lot bigger picture stuff here to do with Russia, China, the future, where grand strategy is getting set up, and most of that is coming from a very long but very fantastic phone call I had with a source of mine, particularly to do with China, Russia, NATO, how the world is looking, and zooming out from what we're looking at in Europe here to much, much larger strategy and things that could be inevitable coming from some very, very in-the-know sources, much more than sources who would be able to be public online. So I hope you look forward to that. I think there's a lot in that. It's heading towards inevitable larger conflict. Okay, so legends, let's start at my folder called Glide Bombs and Aircraft. And what we do know is the glide bombs for Russia have really been an effective weapon on the front line. Of course, there's peaks and troughs, as then we've seen them be jammed. We saw the new antennas come through, and Ukraine is developing a similar sort of glide bomb. We can see this here. This is under the wing of a Su-24. Now, in my opinion, the Su-24 is actually the ugly duckling of the Sukhoi aircraft, but that doesn't matter. If it works, it works. You can see it looks exactly like a Russian bomb, a glide bomb here, of course, the pop-out wings. We'll get a bit of video of this, and this is basically a direct analog, although Ukraine is going to have much more difficulty with these weapon systems. One, they don't have planes like the Su-34 for as fast and as high, and nowhere near as numerous either. And of course, working and operating this close to the front line, these are going to be highly susceptible to air defense as well. And not only air defense, but enemy fighters in the air. We can see that test footage there. So will it have the same effect that the Russian glide bombs have had? No, they just do not have the aircraft and the aircraft that they can lose either to drop hundreds of those. But, of course, we can see that as a weapon that may enter the battlefield. Speaking of aircraft, UAC, United Aircraft Company, new batch of Su-35 S4 plus generation aircraft rolling out. Now, as always, what we do is we don't know how much a batch is, so we go visually confirmed, two more fighter aircraft, Su-35s, heading into the Russian Aerospatial Forces. Now, what we do know is these are an air dominance, air superiority fighter. A lot of these are then escorting, like the Su-35s, R-37, R-73 missiles air-to-air that would be looking to intercept something like this as well. So what we do know is that Russia loss rate is currently positive for Russia of aircraft. They are making more aircraft than they are losing as of this year. But not only that, is they losing an aircraft like the most recent one is a Su-25 being lost, which is an important aircraft, but we're just going off numbers. A Su-35 is a far more capable aircraft than something like a Su-25. So let's continue. Let's talk about drones. And this is something we have spoken about a lot. People didn't believe us, but as I said, it was creating a pseudo environment. It was not it wasn't the reality of it. Now, Financial Times is saying this, that Russia no longer needs Iran's help to sustain the war in Ukraine. Something you and I have been speaking about, but something all of the more activist propaganda accounts have been saying this is the end of the drones, not realizing that Russia has a huge manufacturing base of these. Russia produced more of these than Iran. Now, in this Financial Times, they said, despite the history of cooperation, a weakened Iran is unlikely to have much of an impact on Russia's war effort today. That's because Russia now produces vast quantities of Quran 2 drones domestically, having received the production technology, blueprints, and training from Iran. As we said, received the licensing. We've known this for some time. What people are trying to say is they wanted to make it look like there's multiple countries backing this rather than just the purchase of equipment. Or purchase of even the blueprints. As Russia localized production of at this economic zone, it span off variations, original designs, improving the drone's engine, warheads, and resistance to jamming. So Russia has bought the original, it worked, and then they have beefed it up and up, as we have seen with the new fuselage, engine, and warhead. Similarly, Israel's degradation of Iran's missile production will have limited consequences. Last autumn, Russia received a batch of Iranian FAT-360 missiles and has reportedly requested other models in the past. But it has not even used those FAT-360s in Ukraine, so haven't used any of them. Ukraine estimates that Russia stockpiled some 13,000 missiles of various ranges and can produce up to 200 of them a month. Moscow, it appears, has no acute need for Iranian missiles, nor does it appear that there is some massive shortage of this equipment either, because we can't be short in equipment if all the stockpiles ran out in March 2022. But the war in Iran, thus, like we have said, has more net positive. Well, I know it's now ended, well, officially, but it has more net positive for Russia due to oil price and extension of other nations and Ukraine being out of the news, then negative effects of some bits of technology exchange. Not that it was that much either, but we've spoken about the Quran has been upgrading, and we get footage like this. And what we do know is some of these now can be optically guided. And this is an airfield in Kramatorsk, and you can see the camera on one of these then striking this area. Now, exactly what this is, we don't know. You can see it then impacting there. Of course, these are a very powerful weapon and much less immune to jamming than other smaller types. Rare footage of Quran 2 equipped with an optical electronic station, presumably relying on the power of detonation of the warhead upon arrival. They say it's an assembly shop for drones. Again, we're not sure, but after the footage, we do see a number of vehicles in that area has been destroyed. Now, the UK, coming out of that NATO summit, they have said this. The UK will provide 350 AS RAM air defense missiles. Now, these can be used both in air-to-air and ground-to-air. Now, a lot of these are being used as ground-to-air, but what these are for is these are very, very short range. These are, they say, from missile and drone attacks, not really. Limited effect against some cruise missile, zero effect against ballistic missile, but these are going to be about drone attack. Now, what I'm getting at here is I'm not saying this isn't nothing, but this is nowhere near enough. 350 from the 70 million pounds, so 140 million Australian dollars at least, or 150 maybe, is purchased off the interest generated on that. But 350 is just not enough. We know that by September, there are Ukrainian sources saying that they're going to pump out 700 Quran drones, so that's going to be enough for half of a night. Now, I'm not saying of course it's not that simple, but in a numbers game like this, a lot of these numbers, I think we need to see 10x, like those 20,000 missiles that went to Israel over Ukraine. Now, Russian page Rybar, they have shared this about the Gebura UAV that we have been looking at as well. Now, some things to note in this is the cost of $2,000 to $3,000, and they are overwhelming air defenses, cheap plywood-built drones mixed with a real strike of Ukraine to waste missiles on empty targets, simple but effective. And we have seen this a lot, is these drones, these are just decoys that are soaking up air defense while the real Qurans and others go after targets. And we'll see more and more of this as well, as air defense is in shortage all around the world. Now, let's have a quick look at the maps. Here's Ukraine in the center of the screen. Here is the capital of Kyiv. The red area is occupied since 2022, the purple since 2014, and of course, the red check ground that Russia has made over the past 24 hours. And as of today, we now know that Russia has had a larger month this month than last month, and it's only the 25th, at least on this map. It's the 26th here in Australia. Maybe we'll get an update a little bit later on. But before we actually have a look at the changes, I wanted to have a look at this article from Financial Times again. Russia bets on unjammable drones to gain ground in Ukraine. Of course, the fibre optic drones that we have spoken about, that we saw come into the fold up in Kursk and have not left the battlefield yet. At this point, you're a lucky man if you drive 5 kilometres from the front line and your car is still operational. This is from a drone unit commander. He's telling the Financial Times he and his men sometimes have to walk 15 kilometres at night to reach their positions. Now, what we know is the average age of a Ukrainian soldier is well into their 40s, and a lot of the soldiers are conscripted as well. And what this tells me a lot about, if you're walking 15 kilometres at night, 15k is a long way anyway, but you're walking with a hell of a lot of gear, the fitness absolutely could be of massive concern to even reach that area, as well as the rotation forces as well. Now, Ukrainian supply trucks have reportedly been hit by Russian drones on the road linking Kramatorsk and Dobrapilya. So let's have a look at this. This is Kramatorsk and this is Dobrapilya. And there's a road that runs through here that I'm just drawing with my mouse at the moment, and that this is a large problem. And what we can see is this is some 20 kilometres behind the line. We have seen a lot of Russian drones, like FPV style, operating at that distance, which is a huge problem, moving anything into here. And as this front moves closer and closer, which it looks like it will, these roads are going to become a huge problem, especially if it starts moving in this distance of Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, the large hubs in here. This article also talk about this, and this is what we have spoken about, is this front doesn't need to get here to have huge effect on the efficiency of these hubs. It just needs to move closer. Now, some 30 k's from the front line, on both sides of the front line, roads are being covered with anti-drone nets to attempt to stop fibre optic drones. We know on the fibre optics, though, Russia is far ahead on that at the moment. For now, they're focusing on logistics, hitting 30, 40 kilometres deep. It's quite terrible. What will happen next? We don't know. What Rob Lee says, much is riding on what will happen this summer. If Russia struggles to advance, negotiations may have a better chance in the fall or the winter. But the opposite may happen if Russia manages to make significant gains, or if winter approaches and it looks like Ukraine is having trouble sustaining the fight. Now, what I will say is it looks at the moment, by the kilometre squares data, the situation on the battlefield, and all the things we can measure, we can be incorrect, but it looks like the latter is going to be it. And what we have said is a lot of Russian command, it looks like they can smell blood in the water. And if you were to say right now, will Ukraine be in a better or worse position in 6 months? If you're a betting man, I would say worse. That is how I think a lot of the command is seeing it. And that should be taken into account on morale at the front line, ability for commanders to make moves, as well as negotiation processes. So come back down, and of course we see this red check in here. We see then Shevchenko area, and we do have Suryak. He's taking some leave, so I hope he enjoys his time off. We can see just above Shevchenko, let's have a zoom in, see where this road goes. DivGen map is saying that the Russians are in and around this area, that they've made some ground. So we can confirm in that axis, but we're not sure exactly how far. We see Vasily Dnipro Helia, this is still not under control, which it would be. Of course, we saw Russian up around here by that geolocated footage yesterday. But then I want to look further up, and we have Odradny and Yalta in here. Now, Yalta, the DivGen map is saying that Yalta up to Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, it has come under Russian control, and it does appear by military summaries, geolocation. See these 3 flags in here at 53, 109, and 17. Don't have to show you all of them. Let's step through on this map. So we have, sorry, not on the map. We have Yalta in here. We have the first Russian flag, believe probably second Russian flag right there, and then that's pretty good, third Russian flag in that area. So that area most likely has come under control. We see that around Constantinople, this area coming under control. Advancement here, again, I do not believe this is new advancement at this point in time. If you were to ask me, how does this front line look in here, given my knowledge of attritional warfare, protracted warfare, and the grinding on the front line, I think it would look something more like this at the moment. This is how I think it would be, with, say, an extra, say, 50 square kilometres of ground, maybe more. That's how the front would more likely move rather than these single spires, given the nature of the war. So then we come up Pokrovsk, eastern front. We're looking for Popov Yar, Poltavka. Now this is going to be pretty rough in here. And we have just in this vicinity in here, we have an advancement of Russian forces, a small advancement, but of course from these maps, can't really line that up, but saying that there is some movement in that direction. So NATO. Let's talk about the NATO summit. Let's talk about Trump, Zelensky, Rutte, everyone. And Trump has had a big week. He's bombed Iran. He's told Israel and Iran they don't know what the fuck they're doing. He's ended the war that had the potential to shift into a decade-long or more massively costly war and destabilise the Middle East. It still could, but wait out on that. And on top of it all, he has had the NATO chief refer to him as daddy. And for too long, America has been the mummy, and European NATO countries have been sucking on the teat of American security for very, very cheap while falling below their own set targets. And this was a very short summit with one goal: to get the NATO allies to promise to raise their defence-related spending to 5% of their GDP by 2035. Still 10 years away. Keep that in your mind. For more than a decade, the target was 2%, with a lot of countries still not meeting that 2%. Most European leaders were keen to avoid a rift with the US president. Mark Rutte helped praise Trump and gave him credit. America expects European allies and Canada to contribute more, and that is exactly what we see them doing. Now, over the past 3 years, Putin has given incentive to European states to rearm and expose just how degraded the Western stockpiles were. At times, Russia was firing in a few days more than the entire stockpile of some countries' artillery shells. And we're not talking Latvia or Estonia. We're talking the UK. We're talking France. It was a huge problem. And over the past months, European leaders have been hammering home this idea that we are next. So the reason they're doing this is to convince the public that this massive spending is needed. Now, do I believe that Russia is going to launch into NATO? No. I don't think they've got the capacity, I don't think they've got the ability, and I don't think they've got the want either. But setting this pseudo environment, if we are next, it can make it easier on those decisions. Now, before we go too far down that rabbit hole but what might be next and what rifts are coming here, there has been some changes. So let's talk about Ukrainian air defense. Now, it was asked, and Trump did say he's open to the idea of Ukraine buying more air defense, maybe Patriot systems, but he did acknowledge the shortage and the difficulty to gain this system and more of them as well, and that they need them also. Zelensky wore somewhat of a suit here. I wouldn't call it a suit, but more formal than we typically see. Now, many are disappointed that Ukraine wasn't formally invited or put into NATO at this. That was just never going to happen. I think everyone knew that, but I don't know. But there is some concern, and I do know from some contacts the UK is very concerned about this. Now, Trump was asked about Article 5. You spoke about equipment on US Article 5, and I'll give you the definition once here. Your definition, has it changed in case some NATO members don't meet the threshold? So is Article 5 still in place, Trump, if the threshold isn't met? And what I will say is he does sort of avoid the question. He does talk about how much he's seen these countries, then their passion towards their countries, but talking about the US too, about people want to be friendly with the US, so he does somewhat avoid it. But we are seeing this 5%, at least in my opinion and others I speak to, as a pay-to-play. That if you're not at that 5% and someone hits you, you may be on your own. And that's some of the comments that look like it could be it. So again, we will see. Now, of course, you always see me talk about icebreakers. Trump said he's negotiating with Finland to buy 15 icebreakers. I want to buy them, you are very good at icebreakers. Now, of course, the Arctic Circle, there's a hell of a lot of interest. Why do you think Trump wants to then acquire Greenland? We do know China building icebreakers, Russia building icebreakers, and, of course, facilities up north as well. But one thing we do know is the only country in the world that creates nuclear icebreakers is Russia. So therefore, they're the only ones that can go through some of those areas year round. And I've spoken many times, whether you believe climate change is human or cyclic, I don't care. There's going to be a hell of a lot more interest in the north of the globe as more resources become available, shorter routes for shipping, as some areas down around the Middle East may become more difficult around Africa. So strap in on that. And that is what we've been speaking about for some time. And of course, we did see, very suspiciously, a Russian ship carrying icebreaker parts sink just south of Europe. So, and remember, we spoke about that, and it was that, maybe carried out by a few, but enabled by many. Now, Spain, their Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, which is maybe the most Spanish name ever, said that Madrid considers current defence spending of 2% as sufficient, realistic and compatible with the welfare state. So they're not looking to bump it up to that 5%. Trump says, well, they're doing very well. The economy is doing very well, and the economy could be blown right out of the water without something bad happening. What we're going to do, we're negotiating with Spain on a trade deal, and we're going to make them pay twice as much. And I'm serious about that. I like Spain. It's a great place, great people. But Spain is the only country out of all the countries that refuses to pay. So they want a little bit of a free ride, but they'll have to pay it back to us on trade, because I'm not going to let that happen. That's unfair. And this is one of the problems with security like in Europe, is some of these smaller states might go, not small states, I shouldn't say Spain, but I'm just saying other states. They might go, it has to go through, if someone invades, it has to go through 5 NATO countries before ever getting close to us. So is it worth the spending? That's always the difficulty with coalitions like this, as well as some countries with much larger GDPs going, we're funding so much more than this. For Estonia, they'll chuck in 3 beans, a can of rice, a handful of rice and some baked beans, and that will be their 5% of GDP, where Germany will go, our 5% is billions upon billions of dollars. Again, I think all of this in the future is going to be significantly more friction in Europe. Now, let's go over this. The commitment to raise defence spending over 10 years involves 3.5% of each member state's GDP on core defence expenditure by 35, as 1.5 on broad defined series of investments loosely connected to security infrastructure. 10 years, this will not have an effect on the war in Ukraine. But I still see some major hurdles in this. Of course, this is a photograph of the NATO countries. Many have pointed out Zelensky in this photo. Trump, who is by far the most powerful leader in NATO, he has said that Zelensky and Ukraine is not joining NATO anytime soon, or if ever. Again, there's going to be large friction, because we've seen NATO say that they are on an irreversible path. He's at all the summits. Again, but the US is saying no, at least for the next 3.5 years. We will see. So, but we know 10 years, this war will be over by then, or if it is still going, there won't be anyone bloody left. Now, the biggest problem here is not money. It's Europe's industrial base. To manufacture anything in Europe is massively expensive, and energy is massively expensive, and you're dealing with things like massive amounts of material and labour and steel, raw material, massive energy. This is why all of this has moved overseas. This is why countries like Poland are buying from South Korea, and that's military hardware. But if you just look at industrial base, that's why things are moving away. This is why a Mercedes is 5% better than a Hyundai, but 200% more. Now, my biggest concern on this, and I think Europe should do this, I think Europe should have had more military power for a long time and not be completely reliant on the US. Now, my biggest concern is, will this money actually translate into more lethal militaries? Or will it be absorbed into bureaucracy, salaries, research and development, instead of quantity and lethality? Europe and AUKUS, we have plenty of technology, but we do not have the industry for mass. We have plenty of tech. We have F-35s, but we just can't make 5 million shells a year. And what we do know is in states, these Western liberal states, anything manufacture-wise is unbelievably expensive. You're paying a guy $100 an hour to mill down bits and pieces. To do mass is very, very hard. Capitalist states like this, it benefits R&D. And as I spoke on the phone today to someone, and I said, does this actually going to translate into more lethality? Because if you go back 20 years compared to now, we spend way more. But are we more lethal? I don't know. Now, number 3, something this won't fix is the recruitment struggle from America to Australia to France to Canada to Finland. That, or maybe not Finland with conscription, but still, you know what I mean. National service. I don't know a single country that is actually meeting their recruitment targets. You can have all the kit you want in the world, but you will never replace needing motivated young men to be in the tank, in the plane, in the vehicle, or in the trench. And no one is meeting those current targets. That would be my first thing of how are you going to fix that? 4, as a source told me earlier this week, we're gambling the war will be in the late 2030s, that there will be not a war, the war. Now, this is a common military term, is we train for the war, not a war. A war is what is going on at the moment. You know, when I was in the A war, it's Afghanistan. But the war is a country with a near-peer partner who is very, very powerful. And what I'm saying is we're relying on the mid to late 2030s is when this will happen, because all of this spending is not going to come to fruition. By then, if it happens earlier, we could be in big, big trouble. So I had a very long conversation with someone who is significantly more involved, significantly better filled in, more knowledgeable on all of this situation than myself. Now, this was more directly at the Asia Pacific, but I believe it is still relevant, okay? We've got the West, and if you'll include Australia in that, and of course, as these leaders would say, the axis of evil or the axis of upheaval, okay? And again, this is still all in one. And my key takeaways from this very long but very in-depth conversation was where there's still gambling that the war is going to be mid to late 2030s, and any earlier that we are in trouble. Countries' armed forces, we have wasted the last 15 to 20 years. For example, we were out of shells in the opening of the Ukraine war. And we are very lucky that happened because it gave us force of going, oh shit, we're out in a war that doesn't have our men in it. That if it opened up before this, we would have been out of shells and nowhere else to come from. This is still a very limited war and we ran out of stuff. We haven't had a cohesion between policy, industry, and military command for 15 to 20 years. Between those three, which puts people on the front line in a tank doing the actions, the political policy, the industry, the manufacturing, and the command, there hasn't been cohesion in that for up to 20 years. The fact is, states like Australia do not have, and it is impossible to have, complete sovereign capability, and we haven't had this for 30 to 40 years. We don't even see the term used of manufacturing anymore. So that sovereign capability has been gone for decades, and at this point it would actually be impossible to bring that back. Now, I questioned on this, but the bits that I said, the fact, this was stated straight out by this gentleman, the fact, the only ones who can truly do that on scale is Russia and China. He said these are the only ones that can have complete sovereign capability on mass scale. Now, I questioned on this and said, well, what about the US? And they said the US could possibly do it, but they are still incredibly reliant on Mexico, Japan, Europe, Canada, and Taiwan. And it doesn't look like anymore they can actually do it on the scale that is needed for then war, which is of huge concern. Now, he reiterated a point I made of more money does not equal more lethality. In a lot of this, more money gets pumped into these governments and it just gets soaked into then bureaucracy. If you put in 20% more money, you don't get 20% more weapons. You get 5% more weapons and 15% more pay rises for those at the top. Weapons in Ukraine have a 3-month average cycle before counters are developed, and then they're not anywhere near as effective. So we need to be very, very flexible in our ability and not focus on a short war and technology. We need to focus on a mass protracted war, because if there's a 3-month cycle, we can have all these great systems, but in 3 months there'll be a counter and it's just a cheap system that doesn't work anymore. Excalibur Shell is a good example of this. 6 weeks, I believe it was, 90% decrease in effectiveness. So it was the same as any 155, but way, way more expensive, and you got way, way less of them. You need a mix of high and low. Now, China, they focus on getting it out the door. It doesn't matter if it's perfect, doesn't matter if it's clean, doesn't matter the exact quality, but if it's good enough to get into the battlefield, out the door, they are mass-based. And 11 here is that Chinese soft power, we underestimate that they have soft power everywhere, from influencing governments through Central Asia, into Africa, into Europe, into America, into Australia. Not only that, but then where does all of our equipment come from? Everything I have in this office has some level of being made in China, and what effect will that have if that war comes through? Now, as well, this was very interesting to me because I've floated this before, drawing Russia westwards instead of pushing them east. And he said, I really feel for the Ukrainians. I hope that all of this isn't for nothing. Speaking on what we have spoken about before, is China gives America, sorry, that's wrong. Russia gives China a lot of the shortfalls where they are missing. Submarine technology, some engine technology, anti-submarine technology, experience in war fighting, and of course, massive amounts of resources from food to oil, etc. And what we have said is America, they are not looking at Russia as being the primary threat. They're looking at China being the primary threat. And if there's an opportunity to pull away Russia from China, even if at the expense of Ukraine, it may actually be taken. And he said, these guys are fighting valiantly, and I hope that this isn't all for nothing, and the deal is made to try and draw Russia further towards America and us rather than towards China, and solving those issues around ports and food and resource as well. That if there was a West versus China war, that potentially Russia could actually come out a huge winner due to resource and relationships, depending on their involvement. There's no formal military alliance. And if we do see then there's some level of war between the West and China, where it's going to need to be the entire West, and then we've got China involved, who's going to be buying a shitload of stuff from, physical resource from Russia. He actually said there's people saying that they could actually come out a big winner in that, regardless of their huge cost that this has had at the moment. So this is some very interesting stuff. I wish this guy could speak on a podcast, even anonymously, but that's not going to happen. Now, further on this too, he says war with China is inevitable. And this is from not only him, but what he's being told also. We just don't know when, and we don't know how it's going to look. Will it be proxy somewhere? Will it be naval? Will it be a bombing campaign? But something here is inevitable. Mearsheimer says this as well about the rise of China, that he believes they can't rise peacefully. He said, most likely it will be protracted and hugely costly. And the weapons we start with are not going to be what we end with. And this is why we need flexibility and mass. Now, 3, many are saying, and this isn't just people online, many are saying, the only way to actually win is fight them now, before they are too strong. There is concern about some event happening to start this, because they are getting stronger faster than we are, and maybe we'd have better outcomes now than in the future. Maybe we would win rather than just have it prolonged, bloody, and no winners. Now, our industry is not growing close to China's. Ours is growing, but nowhere near China's industrial mass output. He said the longer China can starve off war, the better position that they will be in. They concentrate on absorbing losses and mass. With Russia being a large power in Europe, can we expect, in Australia, a country like here in Asia, in an Asia-Pacific region, can we expect Europe to aid the war? Can Russia just tie up assets? So what he was getting at is, then you have an extension that Russia just needs to be enough of a threat that Europe's going to go, hey, sorry, Australia, sorry, America, we can't move these assets, because if we do, Russia's going to start coming across borders. They tie that up, so then there's less actual available assets too, while still aiding China in certain ways. He said the future in this, it does look very bleak. He said, regardless of the outcome, it's a lose-lose from Australia. Even if Australia doesn't get involved in this power struggle, what likely will go kinetic, he said it's lose-lose. Australia is rich because of China, and we're secure for now because of America. But either way, whether we were one way, the other, or neutral, we will see a reduction in living standards and freedoms. Either we get stuck in a massive protracted war, or we have protracted war around us, hugely costly in men, of material, of everything as well. Again, going back to this looking bleak. What this is assuming, though, is this is assuming that China doesn't rise peacefully. And it's assuming that America can't let China rise peacefully, which is where most people in this, most academics are sitting, is that no, it's not going to transfer into complete bipolarity peacefully, that there will be actions to try and maintain America's current global influence, power, living standards, and freedoms as well around the world. But we don't know. Maybe they will be able to rise peacefully. Maybe it's not worth the cost for anyone. What we do know is historically and now, it doesn't seem like China's way to have an all-out war like this, and it doesn't look like they've got just total war ambition. They've got ambition with what they would call more domestic stuff with Taiwan, but it doesn't look like a total war ambition, although definitely preparing for it. And this is where there's still some 50-50, but this comes back into number 3 here, is maybe then to fight them now. So the biggest question in all of this, and go and read, was it chapter 9 or 12 in Mayor Sharma's Tragedy of Great Power Politics, is can America let China rise to equal or number 1 without attempting to stop it? It's more of a question of, is America prepared to do that? How does it look if that occurs? How does that actual protracted war really look? Not of expeditionary power, of power into states, on soft power around the world. Again, we do not know, but I thought this was very interesting, and this sort of thing is a much, much larger risk. I know Mark Rutte will say about that Munich is a threat from Russia, but the real threat is the amount of power that Beijing has all around the world, from soft power to hard power to industrial base. And as I've said, if Russia has 4 times the military industry of the West, according to his figures, China has 50. And that is the threat. And it is competing on the global stage for polarity as well. So the question is, can China rise peacefully at their current rate of advancement? Now, from what I'm seeing, most say no, but maybe it will be, and then we'll step into a truly bipolar world, which historically at least has shown to be the more stable system. Maybe that will occur, but we will see. Anyway, legends, I know we went way down the path here. I'm going to go take my Odanzatron, an antiemetic, and my actual drug, so wish me luck. I'm going to be pretty crook over the next couple of days, but look after yourselves, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you.